The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. St. Sophia was at once the inauguration and the culmination of the Byzantine style. Men everywhere spoke of it as the Great Church, and even the skeptical Procopius wrote of it with awe. When one enters this building to pray, he feels that it is not the work of human power. The soul, lifting itself to the sky, realizes that here God is close by, and that he takes delight in this, his chosen home. The Turks, after capturing Constantinople in 1453, covered the mosaics of St. Sophia with plaster, abhorring the graven images as idolatry. But in recent years the Turkish government has permitted a corps of workers from the Byzantine Institute of Boston, Massachusetts, to uncover these unsurpassed examples of the mosaic art. The Turkish conquerors almost atoned by adding 4 graceful minarets, completely harmonious with the domical design. 4. From Constantinople to Ravenna. St. Sophia was Justinian's supreme achievement, more lasting than his conquests or his laws. But Procopius describes 24 other churches built or rebuilt by him in the capital, and remarks, if you should see one of them by itself, you would suppose that the emperor had built this work only, and had spent the whole time of his reign on this one alone. Throughout the empire this fury of construction raged till Justinian's death, and that 6th century, which marked the beginning of the Dark Ages in the West, was in the East one of the richest epochs in architectural history. In Ephesus, Antioch, Gaza, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Salonika, Ravenna, Rome, and from Crimean Kerch to African Sfax, 1,000 churches celebrated the triumph both of Christianity over paganism and of the Oriental Byzantine over the Greco-Roman style. External columns, architraves, pediments, and friezes made way for the vault, the pendentive, and the dome. Syria had a veritable renaissance in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Her schools at Antioch, Berytus, now Beirut, Edessa, and Nisibis poured forth orators, lawyers, historians, and heretics. Her artisans excelled in mosaics, textiles, and all decorative arts. Her architects raised 100 churches. Her sculptors adorned them with lavish reliefs. Alexandria was the one city in the empire that never ceased to prosper. Her founder had chosen for her a site that almost forced the Mediterranean world to use her ports and enhance her trade. None of her ancient or early medieval architecture has survived, but the scattered relics of her work in metal, ivory, wood, and portraiture suggest a people as rich in art as in sensuality and bigotry. Coptic architecture, which had begun with the Roman basilica, became under Justinian predominantly Oriental. The architectural splendor of Ravenna began soon after Honorius made it the seat of the Western Empire in 404. The city prospered in the long regency of Galla Placidia, and the close relations maintained with Constantinople brought Eastern artists and styles to mingle with Italian architects and forms. The typical Oriental plan of a dome placed with pendentives over the transept of a cruciform base appeared there as early as 450 in the mausoleum where Placidia at last found tranquility. Within it one may still see the famous mosaic of Christ as the Good Shepherd. In 458, Bishop Neon added to the domed baptistry of the Basilica Ursiana a series of mosaics that included remarkably individual portraits of the apostles. About 500, Theodoric built for his Arian bishop a cathedral named after St. Apollinaris, the reputed founder of the Christian community in Ravenna. Here, in world-renowned mosaics, the white-robed saints bear themselves with a stiff solemnity that already suggests the Byzantine style. The conquest of Ravenna by Belisarius advanced the victory of Byzantine art in Italy. The church of San Vitale was completed in 547 under Justinian and Theodora, who financed its decoration and lent their unseductive features to its adornment. There is every indication that these mosaics are realistic portraits, and emperor and empress must be credited with courage in permitting their likenesses to be transmitted to posterity. The attitudes of these rulers, ecclesiastics, and eunuchs are hard and angular. Their stiff frontality is a reversion to pre-classical forms. The robes of the women are a mosaic triumph, but we miss here the happy grace of the Parthenon procession, or the Arapachis of Augustus, or the nobility and tenderness of the figures on the portals of Chartres or Reims. 2 years after dedicating San Vitale, the Bishop of Ravenna consecrated Sant'Apollinare in Classe, a second church for the city's patron saint, placed in the maritime suburb that had once been the Adriatic base of the Roman fleet. Here is the old Roman basilican plan, But on the composite capitals a Byzantine touch appears in the acanthus leaves, unclassically curled and twisted, as if blown by some eastern wind. The long rows of perfect columns, the colorful 7th century mosaics in the archivolts and spandrels of the colonnades, the lovely stucco plaques in the choir, the cross of gems on a bed of mosaic stars in the apse, make this one of the outstanding shrines of a peninsula that is almost a gallery of art. 5. The Byzantine Arts. Architecture was the masterpiece of the Byzantine artist, but about it or within it were a dozen other arts in which he achieved some memorable excellence. He did not care for sculpture in the round. The mood of the age preferred color to line. Yet Procopius lauded the sculptors of his time, presumably the carvers of reliefs, as the equals of Phidias and Praxiteles, and some stone sarcophagi of the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries have human figures chiseled with almost Hellenic grace, confused with an Asiatic plethora of ornament. The carving of ivory was a favorite art among the Byzantines. They used it for diptychs, triptychs, book covers, caskets, perfume boxes, statuettes, inlays, and in 100 decorative ways. In this craft, Hellenistic techniques survived unimpaired and merely turned gods and heroes into Christ and the saints. The ivory chair of Bishop Maximian in the Basilica Ursiana at Ravenna, circa 550, is a major achievement and a minor art. While the Far East in the 6th century was experimenting with oil colors, Byzantine painting adhered to traditional Greek methods. Encaustic, colors burned into panels of wood, canvas, or linen; fresco, colors mixed with lime and applied to wet plaster surfaces; and tempera, colors mixed with size or gum or glue and white of egg and applied to panels or to plaster already dry. The Byzantine painter knew how to represent distance and depth, but usually shirked the difficulties of perspective by filling in the background with buildings and screens. Portraits were numerous, but few have survived. Church walls were decorated with murals. The fragments that remain show a rough realism, unshapely hands, stunted figures, sallow faces, and incredible coiffures. The Byzantine artist excelled and reveled in the minute. His extant masterpieces of painting are not murals or panels, but the miniatures with which he literally illuminated, made bright with color, the publications of his age. Books, being costly, were adorned like other precious objects. The miniaturist first sketched his design upon papyrus, parchment, or vellum with a fine brush or pen, laid down a background, usually in gold or blue, filled in his colors, and decorated background and borders with graceful and delicate forms. At first he had merely elaborated the initial letter of a chapter or a page. Sometimes he essayed a portrait of the author. Then he illustrated the text with pictures. Finally, as his art improved, he almost forgot the text and spread himself out in luxurious ornament, taking a geometrical or floral motive or a religious symbol and repeating it in a maze of variations until all the page was a glory of color and line, and the text seemed like an intrusion from a coarser world. The illumination of manuscripts had been practiced in Pharaonic and Ptolemaic Egypt, and had passed thence to Hellenistic Greece and Rome. The Vatican treasures an Aeneid, the Ambrosian library at Milan an Iliad, both ascribed to the 4th century and completely classic in ornament. The transition from pagan to Christian miniatures appears in the Topographia Christiana of Cosmas Indicopleustes, circa 547, who earned his sobriquet by sailing to India and his fame by trying to prove that the earth is flat. The oldest extant religious miniature is a 5th century Genesis, now in the Library of Vienna. The text is written in gold and silver letters on 24 leaves of purple vellum. The 48 miniatures, in white, green, violet, red, and black, picture the story of man from Adam's fall to Jacob's death. Quite as beautiful are the Joshua Rotulus, little roll of the Book of Joshua in the Vatican, and the Book of the Gospels, illuminated by the monk Rabula in Mesopotamia in 586. From Mesopotamia and Syria came the figures and symbols that dominated the iconography or picture writing of the Byzantine world. Repeated in 1,000 forms in the minor arts, they became stereotyped and conventional, and shared in producing the deadly immutability of Byzantine art. Loving brilliance and permanence, the Byzantine painter made mosaic his favorite medium. For floors he chose tesserae of colored marble, as Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans had done. For other surfaces he used cubes of glass or enamel in every shade, cut in various sizes, but usually 1/8 of an inch square. Precious stones were sometimes mingled with the cubes. Mosaic was often employed in making portable pictures or icons, to be set up in churches or homes, or carried on travels as aids to devotion and safety. Preferably, however, the mosaicist sought the larger scope of church or palace walls. In his studio, upon a canvas bearing a colored design, he tentatively laid his cubes, and here his art was strained to produce immediately under his hand the precise gradation and melting of colors to be felt by other eyes from greater distances. Meanwhile, a coat of heavy cement and then a coat of fine cement were laid upon the surface to be covered. Into this matrix the mosaicist, following his canvas model, pressed his cubes, usually with cut edges to the front to catch the light. Curved surfaces like domes, and the conches or shell-like half-domes of apses, were favored, since they would catch at different times and angles a variety of softened and shaded light. From this painstaking art, Gothic would derive part of its inspiration for stained glass. Such glass is mentioned in 5th century texts, but no example remains, and apparently the stain was external, not fused. Glass cutting and blowing were now 1,000 years old, and Syria, their earliest known home, was still a center of the crafts. The art of engraving precious metals or stones had deteriorated since Aurelius. Byzantine gems, coins, and seals are of relatively poor design and workmanship. Jewelers, nevertheless, sold their products to nearly every class, for ornament was the soul of Byzantium. Goldsmith and silversmith studios were numerous in the capital. Gold pyxes, chalices, and reliquaries adorned many altars, and silver plate oppressed the tables of moneyed homes. Every house, almost every person, carried some textile finery. Egypt led the way here with its delicate, many-colored, figured fabrics, garments, curtains, hangings, and coverings. The Copts were the masters in these fields. Certain Egyptian tapestries of this period are almost identical in technique with the Gobelins. Byzantine weavers made silk brocades, embroideries, even embroidered shrouds, linens realistically painted with the features of the dead. In Constantinople, a man was known by the garments he wore. Each class prized and defended some distinctive refinement of dress, and a Byzantine assemblage doubtless shone like a peacock's tail. Among all classes, music was popular. It played a rising role in the liturgy of the church and helped to fuse emotion into belief. In the 4th century, Alypius wrote a musical introduction, whose extant portions are our chief guide to the musical notation of the Greeks. This representation of notes by letters was replaced in that century by abstract signs, or numes. Ambrose apparently introduced these to Milan, Hilary to Gaul, Jerome to Rome. About the end of the 5th century, Romanus, a Greek monk, composed the words and music of hymns that still form part of the Greek liturgy, and have never been equaled in depth of feeling and power of expression. Boethius wrote an essay De Musica, summarizing the theories of Pythagoras, Aristoxenus, and Ptolemy. This little treatise was used as a text in music at Oxford and Cambridge until our times. One must be an Oriental to understand an Oriental art. To a Western mind, the essence of Byzantinism means that the East had become supreme in the heart and head of Greece. In the autocratic government, the hierarchical stability of classes, the stagnation of science and philosophy, the state-dominated church, the religion-dominated people, the gorgeous vestments and stately ceremonies, the sonorous and scenic ritual, the hypnotic chant of repetitious music, the overwhelming of the senses with brilliance and color, the conquest of naturalism by imagination, the submergence of representative under decorative art. The ancient Greek spirit would have found this alien and unbearable, but Greece herself was now part of the Orient. An Asiatic lassitude fell upon the Greek world precisely when it was to be challenged in its very life by the renewed vitality of Persia and the incredible energy of Islam. Chapter 7. The Persians, 224 to 641. 1. Sasanian Society. Beyond the Euphrates or the Tigris, through all the history of Greece and Rome, lay that almost secret empire which for 1,000 years had stood off expanding Europe and Asiatic hordes, never forgetting its Achaemenid glory, slowly recuperating from its Parthian wars, and so proudly maintaining its unique and aristocratic culture under its virile Sasanian monarchs that it would transform the Islamic conquest of Iran into a Persian Renaissance. Iran meant more in our 3rd century than Iran or Persia today. It was by its very name the land of the Aryans, and included Afghanistan, Baluchistan, Sogdiana, and Balkh, as well as Iraq. Persia, anciently the name of the modern province of Fars, was but a southeastern fraction of this empire, but the Greeks and Romans, careless about barbarians, gave the name of a part to the whole. Through the center of Iran, from Himalayan southeast to Caucasian northwest, ran a mountainous dividing barrier. To the east was an arid, lofty plateau. To the west lay the green valleys of the twin rivers, whose periodic overflow ran into a labyrinth of canals and made western Persia rich in wheat and dates, vines and fruits. Between or along the rivers, or hiding in the hills, or hugging desert oases, were a myriad of villages, 1,000 towns, 100 cities. Ecbatana, Rai, Mosul, Istakhr, once Persepolis, Susa, Seleucia, and magnificent Ctesiphon, seat of the Sasanian kings. Ammianus describes the Persians of this period as almost all slender, somewhat dark, with not uncomely beards, and long shaggy hair. The upper classes were not shaggy, nor always slender, often handsome, proud of bearing, and of an easy grace, with a flair for dangerous sports and splendid dress. Men covered their heads with turbans, their legs with baggy trousers, their feet with sandals or laced boots. The rich wore coats or tunics of wool and silk, and girt themselves with belt and sword. The poor resigned themselves to garments of cotton, hair, or skins. The women dressed in boots and breeches, loose shirts, and cloaks and flowing robes, curled their black hair into a coil in front, let it hang behind, and brightened it with flowers. All classes loved color and ornament. Priests and zealous Zoroastrians affected white cotton clothing as a symbol of purity. Generals preferred red. Kings distinguished themselves with red shoes, blue trousers, and a headdress topped with an inflated ball or the head of a beast or bird. In Persia, as in all civilized societies, clothes made half the man, and slightly more of the woman. The typical educated Persian was Gallicanly impulsive, enthusiastic, and mercurial, often indolent but quickly alert, given to mad and extravagant talk, rather crafty than courageous, and to be feared only at long range, which was where they kept their enemies. The poor drank beer, but nearly all classes, including the gods, preferred wine. The pious and thrifty Persians poured it out in religious ritual, waited a reasonable time for the gods to come and drink, then drank the sacred beverage themselves. Persian manners in this Sasanian period are described as coarser than in the Achaemenid, more refined than in the Parthian. But the narratives of Procopius leave us with the impression that the Persians continued to be better gentlemen than the Greeks. The ceremonies and diplomatic forms of the Persian court were in large measure adopted by the Greek emperors. The rival sovereigns addressed each other as brother, provided immunity and safe conducts for foreign diplomats, and exempted them from customs searches and dues. The conventions of European and American diplomacy may be traced to the courts of the Persian kings. Most Persians, Ammianus reported, are extravagantly given to venery, but he confesses that pederasty and prostitution were less frequent among them than among the Greeks. Rabbi Gamaliel praised the Persians for 3 qualities. They are temperate in eating, modest in the privy, and in marital relations. Every influence was used to stimulate marriage and the birth rate in order that manpower should suffice in war. In this aspect, Mars, not Venus, is the god of love. Religion enjoined marriage, celebrated it with awesome rites, and taught that fertility strengthened Ormuzd, the god of light, in his cosmic conflict with Ahriman, the Satan of the Zoroastrian creed. The head of the household practiced ancestor worship at the family hearth and sought offspring to ensure his own later cult and care. If no son was born to him, he adopted one. Parents generally arranged the marriage of their children, often with the aid of a professional matrimonial agent, but a woman might marry against the wishes of her parents. Dowries and marriage settlements financed early marriage and parentage. Polygamy was allowed and was recommended where the first wife proved barren. Adultery flourished. The husband might divorce his wife for infidelity. The wife might divorce her husband for desertion and cruelty. Concubines were permitted. Like the ancient Greek hetairae, these concubines were free to move about in public and to attend the banquets of the men, but legal wives were usually kept in private apartments in the home. This old Persian custom was bequeathed to Islam. Persian women were exceptionally beautiful, and perhaps men had to be guarded from them. In the Shahnameh of Firdausi, it is the women who yearn and take the initiative in courtship and seduction. Feminine charms overcame masculine laws. Children were reared with the help of religious belief, which seems indispensable to parental authority. They amused themselves with ball games, athletics, and chess, and at an early age joined in their elders' pastimes, archery, horse racing, polo, and the hunt. Every Sasanian found music necessary to the operations of religion, love, and war. Music and the songs of beautiful women, said Firdausi, accompanied the scene at royal banquets and receptions. Lyre, guitar, flute, pipe, horn, drum, and other instruments abounded. Tradition avers that Khosrow Parvez's favorite singer, Barbad, composed 360 songs and sang them to his royal patron, one each night for a year. In education, too, religion played a major part. Primary schools were situated on temple grounds and were taught by priests. Higher education in literature, medicine, science, and philosophy was provided in the celebrated academy at Jundi Shapur in Susiana. The sons of feudal chiefs and provincial satraps often lived near the king and were instructed with the princes of the royal family in a college attached to the court. Pahlavi, the Indo-European language of Parthian Persia, continued in use. Of its literature in this age, only some 600,000 words survive, nearly all dealing with religion. We know that it was extensive, but as the priests were its guardians and transmitters, they allowed most of the secular material to perish. A like process may have deluded us as to the overwhelmingly religious character of early medieval literature in Christendom. The Sasanian kings were enlightened patrons of letters and philosophy. Khosrow Anushirvan above all. He had Plato and Aristotle translated into Pahlavi, and had them taught at Jundi Shapur, and even read them himself. During his reign, many historical annals were compiled, of which the sole survivor is the Karnamak-i-Artakshatar, or Deeds of Ardashir, a mixture of history and romance that served Firdausi as the basis of his Shahnameh. When Justinian closed the schools of Athens, 7 of their professors fled to Persia and found refuge at Khosrow's court. In time they grew homesick, and in his treaty of 533 with Justinian, the barbarian king stipulated that the Greek sages should be allowed to return and be free from persecution. Under this enlightened monarch, the College of Jundi Shapur, which had been founded in the 4th or 5th century, became the greatest intellectual center of the time. Students and teachers came to it from every quarter of the world. Nestorian Christians were received there and brought Syriac translations of Greek works in medicine and philosophy. Neoplatonists there planted the seeds of Sufi mysticism. There the medical lore of India, Persia, Syria, and Greece mingled to produce a flourishing school of therapy. In Persian theory, disease resulted from contamination and impurity of one or more of the 4 elements: fire, water, earth, and air. Public health, said Persian physicians and priests, required the burning of all putrefying matter, and individual health demanded strict obedience to the Zoroastrian code of cleanliness. Of Persian astronomy in this period, we only know that it maintained an orderly calendar, divided the year into 12 months of 30 days, each month into 2 7-day and 2 8-day weeks, and added 5 intercalary days at the end of the year. Astrology and magic were universal. No important step was taken without reference to the status of the constellations, and every earthly career, men believed, was determined by the good and evil stars that fought in the sky. As angels and demons fought in the human soul, the ancient war of Ormuzd and Ahriman. The Zoroastrian religion was restored to authority and affluence by the Sasanian dynasty. Lands and tithes were assigned to the priests. Government was founded on religion, as in Europe. An archimagus, second only to the king in power, headed an omnipresent hereditary priestly caste of magi, who controlled nearly all the intellectual life of Persia, frightened sinners and rebels with threats of hell, and kept the Persian mind and masses in bondage for 4 centuries. Now and then they protected the citizen against the tax-gatherer and the poor against oppression. The Magian organization was so rich that kings sometimes borrowed great sums from the temple treasuries. Every important town had a fire temple in which a sacred flame, supposedly inextinguishable, symbolized the god of light. Only a life of virtue and ritual cleanliness could save the soul from Ahriman. In the battle against that devil, it was vital to have the aid of the Magi and their magic, their divinations, incantations, sorceries, and prayers. So helped, the soul would attain holiness and purity, pass the awful assize of the Last Judgment, and enjoy everlasting happiness in paradise. Around this official faith, other religions found modest room. Mithras, the sun god so popular with the Parthians, received a minor worship as chief helper of Ormuzd. But the Zoroastrian priests, like the Christians, Muslims, and Jews, made persistent apostasy from the national creed a capital crime. When Mani, circa 216 to 276, claiming to be a fourth divine messenger in the line of Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus, announced a religion of celibacy, pacifism, and quietism, the militant and nationalistic Magi had him crucified, and Manichaeism had to seek its main success abroad. To Judaism and Christianity, however, the Sasanian priests and kings were generally tolerant, much as the popes were more lenient with Jews than with heretics. A large number of Jews found asylum in the western provinces of the Persian Empire. Christianity was already established there when the Sasanians came to power. It was tolerated until it became the official faith of Persia's immemorial enemies, Greece and Rome. It was persecuted after its clergy, as at Nisibis in 338, took an active part in the defense of Byzantine territory against Shapur II, and the Christians in Persia revealed their natural hopes for a Byzantine victory. In 341, Shapur ordered the massacre of all Christians in his empire. Entire villages of Christians were being slaughtered when he restricted the proscription to priests, monks, and nuns. Even so, 16,000 Christians died in a persecution that lasted till Shapur's death in 379. Yezdegerd I, from 399 to 420, restored religious freedom to the Christians and helped them rebuild their churches. In 422, a council of Persian bishops made the Persian Christian Church independent of both Greek and Roman Christianity. Within the framework of religious worship and dispute, governmental edicts and crises, civil and foreign wars, the people impatiently provided the sinews of state and church, tilling the soil, pasturing flocks, practicing handicrafts, arguing trade. Agriculture was made a religious duty, to clear the wilderness, cultivate the earth, eradicate pests and weeds, reclaim wastelands, harness the streams to irrigate the land. These heroic labors, the people were told, ensured the final victory of Ormuzd over Ahriman. Much spiritual solace was needed by the Persian peasant, for usually he toiled as tenant for a feudal lord and paid from a sixth to a third of his crops in taxes and dues. About 540, the Persians took from India the art of making sugar from the cane. The Greek emperor Heraclius found a treasury of sugar in the royal palace at Ctesiphon in 627. The Arabs, conquering Persia 14 years later, soon learned to cultivate the plant and introduced it into Egypt, Sicily, Morocco, and Spain, whence it spread through Europe. Animal husbandry was a Persian forte. Persian horses were second only to Arab steeds in pedigree, spirit, beauty, and speed. Every Persian loved a horse as Rustam loved Rakush. The dog was so useful in guarding flocks and homes that the Persians made him a sacred animal, and the Persian cat acquired distinction universally. Persian industry under the Sasanians developed from domestic to urban forms. Guilds were numerous, and some towns had a revolutionary proletariat. Silk weaving was introduced from China. Sasanian silks were sought for everywhere and served as models for the textile art in Byzantium, China, and Japan. Chinese merchants came to Iran to sell raw silk and buy rugs, jewels, rouge. Armenians, Syrians, and Jews connected Persia, Byzantium, and Rome in slow exchange. Good roads and bridges, well patrolled, enabled state posts and merchant caravans to link Ctesiphon with all provinces, and harbors were built in the Persian Gulf to quicken trade with India. Governmental regulations limited the price of corn, medicines, and other necessaries, and prevented corners and monopolies. We may judge the wealth of the upper classes by the story of the baron who, having invited 1,000 guests to dinner and finding that he had only 500 dinner services, was able to borrow 500 more from his neighbors. The feudal lords, living chiefly on their rural estates, organized the exploitation of land and men, and raised regiments from their tenantry to fight the nation's wars. They trained themselves to battle by following the chase with passion and bravery. They served as gallant cavalry officers, man and animal armored as in later feudal Europe. But they fell short of the Romans in disciplining their troops or in applying the latest engineering arts of siege and defense. Above them in social caste were the great aristocrats who ruled the provinces as satraps, or headed departments of the government. Administration must have been reasonably competent, for though taxation was less severe than in the Roman Empire of East or West, the Persian treasury was often richer than that of the emperors. Khosrow Parvez had $460 million in his coffers in 626, and an annual income of $170 million, enormous sums in terms of the purchasing power of medieval silver and gold. Law was created by the kings, their counselors, and the magi, on the basis of the old Avestan Code. Its interpretation and administration were left to the priests. Ammianus, who fought the Persians, reckoned their judges as upright men of proved experience and legal learning. In general, Persians were known as men of their word. Oaths in court were surrounded with all the aura of religion. Violated oaths were punished severely in law, and in hell by an endless shower of arrows, axes, and stones. Ordeals were used to detect guilt. Suspects were invited to walk over red-hot substances, or go through fire, or eat poisoned food. Infanticide and abortion were forbidden with heavy penalties. Pederasty was punished with death. The detected adulterer was banished. The adulteress lost her nose and ears. Appeal could be made to higher courts, and sentences of death could be carried out only after review and approval by the king. The king attributed his power to the gods, presented himself as their vice-gerent, and emulated their superiority to their own decrees. He called himself, when time permitted, King of Kings, King of the Aryans and the non-Aryans, Sovereign of the universe, Descendant of the gods. Shapur II added, Brother of the sun and moon, Companion of the stars. Theoretically absolute, the Sasanian monarch usually acted with the advice of his ministers, who composed a council of state. Masudi, the Muslim historian, praised the excellent administration of the Sasanian kings, their well-ordered policy, their care for their subjects, and the prosperity of their domains. Said Khosru Anushirvan, according to Ibn Khaldun, Without army, no king. Without revenues, no army. Without taxes, no revenue. Without agriculture, no taxes. Without just government, no agriculture. In normal times, the monarchical office was hereditary, but might be transmitted by the king to a younger son. In 2 instances, the supreme power was held by queens. When no direct heir was available, the nobles and prelates chose a ruler, but their choice was restricted to members of the royal family. The life of the king was an exhausting round of obligations. He was expected to take fearlessly to the hunt. He moved to it in a brocaded pavilion drawn by 10 camels royally dressed. 7 camels carried his throne, 100 bore his minstrels. 10,000 knights might accompany him, but if we may credit the Sasanian rock reliefs, he had at last to mount a horse, face in the first person a stag, ibex, antelope, buffalo, tiger, lion, or some other of the animals gathered in the king's park or paradise. Back in his palace he confronted the chores of government amid 1,000 attendants and in a maze of officious ceremony. He had to dress himself in robes heavy with jewelry, seat himself on a golden throne, and wear a crown so burdensome that it had to be suspended an invisible distance from his immovable head. So he received ambassadors and guests, observed 1,000 punctilios of protocol, passed judgment, received appointments and reports. Those who approached him prostrated themselves, kissed the ground, rose only at his bidding, and spoke to him through a handkerchief held to their mouths, lest their breath infect or profane the king. At night he retired to one of his wives or concubines and eugenically disseminated his superior seed. 2. Sasanian royalty. Sasan in Persian tradition was the priest of Persepolis. His son Papik was a petty prince of Kur. Papik killed Gozir, ruler of the province of Persis, made himself king of the province, and bequeathed his power to his son Shapur. Shapur died of a timely accident and was succeeded by his brother Ardashir. Artabanus V, last of the Arsacid or Parthian kings of Persia, refused to recognize this new local dynasty. Ardashir overthrew Artabanus in battle in 224 and became king of kings in 226. He replaced the loose feudal role of the Arsacids with a strong royal power governing through a centralized but spreading bureaucracy, won the support of the priestly caste by restoring the Zoroastrian hierarchy and faith, and roused the pride of the people by announcing that he would destroy Hellenistic influence in Persia, avenge Darius II against the heirs of Alexander, and reconquer all the territory once held by the Achaemenid kings. He almost kept his word. His swift campaigns extended the boundaries of Persia to the Oxus in the northeast and to the Euphrates in the west. Dying in 241, he placed the crown on the head of his son Shapur and bade him drive the Greeks and Romans into the sea. Shapur, or Sapor I, from 241 to 272, inherited all the vigor and craft of his father. The rock reliefs represent him as a man of handsome and noble features, but these reliefs were doubtless stylized compliments. He received a good education and loved learning. He was so charmed by the conversation of the sophist Eustathius, the Greek ambassador, that he thought of resigning his throne and becoming a philosopher. Unlike his later namesake, he gave full freedom to all religions, allowed Mani to preach at his court, and declared that Magi, Manichaeans, Jews, Christians, and all men of whatever religion should be left undisturbed in his empire. Continuing Ardashir's redaction of the Avesta, he persuaded the priests to include in this Persian Bible secular works on metaphysics, astronomy, and medicine, mostly borrowed from India and Greece. He was a liberal patron of the arts. He was not as great a general as Shapur II or the two Khosrus, but he was the ablest administrator in the long Sasanian line. He built a new capital at Shapur, whose ruins still bear his name, and at Shushtar, on the Karun River, he raised one of the major engineering works of antiquity, a dam of granite blocks forming a bridge 1,710 feet long and 20 feet wide. The course of the stream was temporarily changed to allow the construction. Its bed was solidly paved, and great sluice gates regulated the flow. Tradition says that Shapur used Roman engineers and prisoners to design and build this dam, which continued to function to our own century. Turning reluctantly to war, Shapur invaded Syria, reached Antioch, and was defeated by a Roman army, and made a peace in 244 that restored to Rome all that he had taken. Resenting Armenia's cooperation with Rome, he entered that country and established there a dynasty friendly to Persia in 252. His right flank so protected, he resumed the war with Rome, defeated and captured the Emperor Valerian in 260, sacked Antioch, and took thousands of prisoners to forced labor in Iran. Odenathus, governor of Palmyra, joined forces with Rome and compelled Shapur again to resign himself to the Euphrates as the Roman-Persian frontier. His successors from 272 to 302 were royal mediocrities. History makes short shrift of Hormizd II from 302 to 309, for he maintained prosperity and peace. He went about repairing public buildings and private dwellings, especially those of the poor, all at state expense. He established a new court of justice, devoted to hearing the complaints of the poor against the rich, and often presided himself. We do not know if these strange habits precluded his son from inheriting the throne. In any case, when Hormizd died, the nobles imprisoned his son and gave the throne to his unborn child, whom they confidently hailed as Shapur II. And to make matters clear, they crowned the fetus by suspending the royal diadem over the mother's womb. With this good start, Shapur II entered upon the longest reign in Asiatic history, from 309 to 379. From childhood he was trained for war. He hardened his body and will, and at 16 took the government and the field. Invading eastern Arabia, he laid waste a score of villages, killed thousands of captives, and led others into bondage by cords attached to their wounds. In 337 he renewed the war with Rome for mastery of the trade routes to the Far East, and continued it with pacific intervals, almost till his death. The conversion of Rome and Armenia to Christianity gave the old struggle a new intensity, as if the gods in Homeric frenzy had joined the fray. Through 40 years, Shapur fought a long line of Roman emperors. Julian drove him back to Ctesiphon, but retreated ingloriously. Jovian, outmaneuvered, was forced to a peace in 363 that yielded to Shapur the Roman provinces on the Tigris and all Armenia. When Shapur II died, Persia was at the height of its power and prestige, and 100,000 acres had been improved with human blood. In the next century, war moved to the eastern frontier. About 425, a Turanian people known to the Greeks as Ephthalites, and mistakenly called White Huns, captured the region between the Oxus and the Jaxartes. The Sasanian king Bahram I, from 420 to 438, named Gur, the wild ass because of his reckless hunting feats, fought them successfully, but after his death they spread through fertility and war, and built an empire extending from the Caspian to the Indus, with its capital at Gurgan and its chief city at Balkh. They overcame and slew King Firuz, from 459 to 484, and forced King Balas, from 484 to 488, to pay them tribute. So threatened in the east, Persia was at the same time thrown into chaos by the struggle of the monarchy to maintain its authority against the nobles and the priests. Kavad I, from 488 to 531, thought to weaken these enemies by encouraging a communist movement which had made them the chief object of its attack. About 490, Mazdak, a Zoroastrian priest, had proclaimed himself God sent to preach an old creed, that all men are born equal, that no one has any natural right to possess more than another, that property and marriage are human inventions and miserable mistakes, and that all goods and all women should be the common property of all men. His enemies claimed that he condoned theft, adultery, and incest as natural protests against property and marriage, and as legitimate approximations to utopia. The poor and some others heard him gladly, but Mazdak was probably surprised to receive the approval of a king. His followers began to plunder not only the homes but the harems of the rich, and to carry off for their own uses the most illustrious and costly concubines. The outraged nobles imprisoned Kavad and set his brother Jamasp upon the throne. After 3 years in the Castle of Oblivion, Kavad escaped and fled to the Ephthalites. Eager to have a dependent as the ruler of Persia, they provided him with an army and helped him to take Ctesiphon. Jamasp abdicated, the nobles fled to their estates, and Kavad was again king of kings in 499. Having made his power secure, he turned upon the communists and put Mazdak and thousands of his followers to death. Perhaps the movement had raised the status of labor, for the decrees of the Council of State were henceforth signed not only by princes and prelates, but also by the heads of the major guilds. Kavad ruled for another generation, fought with success against his friends, the Ephthalites, inconclusively with Rome, and dying left the throne to his second son, Khosru, the greatest of Sasanian kings. Khosru I, or Fair Glory, 531 to 579, was called Khosroes by the Greeks, Kisra by the Arabs. The Persians added the cognomen Anushirvan, or Immortal Soul. When his older brothers conspired to depose him, he put all his brothers to death, and all their sons but one. His subjects called him the Just, and perhaps he merited the title if we separate justice from mercy. Procopius described him as a past master at feigning piety and breaking his word, but Procopius was of the enemy. The Persian historian Al-Tabari praised Khosru's penetration, knowledge, intelligence, courage, and prudence, and put into his mouth an inaugural speech well invented, if not true. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.